The underlying theme of this chapter is the need for counselors to be honest and self-searching in determining the impact of their behavior on clients. So in this chapter, we're going to focus on boundary issues in professional practice, establishing appropriate boundaries, the difference between boundary crossing and boundary violations, multiple relationships, and sexual issues in therapy. In order to begin, let's get a clear definition of what a multiple relationship is. A professional role with a person in addition to another role with that same individual, or with another person who is close to that individual. Counselors must learn how to effectively and ethically manage multiple relationships, including dealing with the power differential that is a basic part of most professional relationships, managing boundary issues, and striving to avoid the misuse of power. Think about it. In the therapeutic relationship, your client is disclosing a lot of information, personal information, intimate information, and therefore you have a lot more knowledge about them than they do about you. So that puts you in a power position. You need to be honest and self-searching in determining the impact of your behavior on your clients. Counselors should avoid any involvement with clients that might impair their judgment and objectivity, affect their ability to render effective services, and result in harm or exploitation of the client. Whose needs are being met, the counselor or the client? Always keep that in mind. Although dual relationships are not always harmful to clients, it is essential for professionals to recognize the potential for harm associated with any kind of blending of roles. So keep this in mind. The mere existence of a dual relationship doesn't constitute malpractice. It's the harming or exploiting a client that is unethical. There could be errors in judgment when self-interest is involved. Other concerns include the misuse of power and influence. Dual relationships tend to impair the counselor's judgment, increase potential for conflicts of interest, lead to exploitation of the client, and lead to blurred boundaries. In order to safeguard and protect clients, you really need to ask yourself these questions in considering a dual relationship. Is the relationship necessary? Can it cause harm? Would it be beneficial? Can it disrupt the therapeutic relationship? And can I remain objective? Always evaluate the risk to clients and act responsibly. Your 2014 ACA Code of Ethics has really gotten very clear on dual relationships and boundaries. So throughout this lecture, I've quoted several of those because it is the most up-to-date Code of Ethics, and it also includes interactions with electronics. So let's look at the first one, ACA 2014-46E. Counselors should avoid entering into a non-professional relationship with clients, former clients, their romantic partners, or their family members when the interaction is potentially harmful to the client. This applies to both in-person and electronic interactions or relationships. Facebook, for example, texting. Let's look at the difference between a boundary crossing and a boundary violation. Now, I believe that if you don't ever have a boundary crossing, you can't have a boundary violation. And so for me, aspirational ethics includes not going over your boundary crossings. A boundary crossing is a departure from commonly accepted practices that could potentially benefit clients. So for example, if you're a client in recovery and you want your counselor to come to an AA meeting and give you your 90-day chip. Now, that could really benefit the client. You're supporting them, you know they care, the client knows you care, so that could be a good boundary crossing. But if you think about it in the long run, What other events or social activities might your client want you to be involved in? Just something to think about. A boundary violation is a serious breach that results in harm to clients. Those are usually relationships. Don't let your boundary crossings become boundary violations. Some of the potential for creating a dual relationship includes things like accepting a client's invitation to a special event, bartering for goods or services, for professional services, accepting a small gift from a client, attending the same social, cultural, or religious activities, or giving a supportive hug. Now, some of these seem very innocent, and they could be, they really could be, but they could also be misconstrued, like giving a supportive hug. Might be supportive to you, but to your client and maybe some of their issues, they might read more into it. ACA A6B, extending counseling boundaries. Counselors should consider the risks and benefits of extending current counseling relationships beyond conventional parameters. In extending these boundaries, counselors should take appropriate professional precautions such as informed consent, consultation, supervision, and documentation to ensure that judgment is not impaired and no harm occurs. Some problematic boundary behaviors could include issues such as social. Maybe going to a social event with a client, going out to coffee with a client, financial, asking for a loan, getting to a business adventure together, workplace relationships. You never want to counsel somebody who you work with or a relative of somebody who you work with. Business relationships. We've talked about that before. Now think about this. I had an ethics violation a while back on a treatment center who really felt like they could help out their clients by hiring them to work in some of their other businesses. And when an ethics complaint was filed against them, the owners and the counselors of the counseling center said, hey, we're helping our clients. This is going to benefit them. This is going to help them. We don't see anything wrong with hiring them in another part of our business. Well, I asked them, I said, well, you live in a really small rural area and there's not any other treatment centers around. What happens if your clients who now you've hired to work for you has a relapse? Where are they going to go? That is a clear dual relationship, and at that point it could become harmful to the client. Multiple relationships with clients, students, or supervisees. So you don't want to take on, if I'm supervising somebody, I don't want to take them on as a client also to do counseling with. Physical touch of current or former clients, students, or supervisees. Just be careful when it comes to that situation. Role blending is sometimes inevitable in the process of educating and supervisor counselor trainees. Just be careful that exploitation doesn't occur. There are some measures that can minimize the risk of dual relationships. One of them is to maintain healthy boundaries from the outset. Set those boundaries, be clear with them, talk to your clients about them. Use informed consent to discuss issues surrounding dual relationships, if it's difficult not to have one. For example, if you go to the same church together. Talk with clients about any potential conflicts that might arise. Consult with other professionals when dilemmas arise. Document any dual relationships in case notes. Remember in the last chapter that we talked about how important documentation is, not only for your client, but for you also. And refer when necessary. Professionals get into trouble when their boundaries are poorly defined. Your ACA 2014 A6C does talk about documenting boundary extensions. If you decide that a boundary extension is beneficial and you go into one, if boundaries are extended, the counselor must, prior to the interaction, document the rationale for such an interaction, the potential benefit and anticipated consequences for the client or former client and other individuals significantly involved with the client or former client. If unintentional harm occurs, the counselor must have evidence of an attempt to remedy such harm. Some suggested nevers, and this is just a suggestion because you do want to take things such as age, diagnosis, culture in making some of these decisions. But some suggested nevers are never touch a client, never indulge in boundary crossing because then it won't go into a boundary violation. Never go to lunch or have coffee with a client. Never treat a spouse, really, or a friend of a client. Never meet clients in social situations. And try not to ever join the same church or synagogue as your client is in. Some of the main issues that you'll need to consider when deciding on whether you want to have a dual relationship or not is, what's the potential risk of harming your client? Could there possibly be a conflict of interest? Will the dual relationship impair the counselor's judgment? Will the client's rights or autonomy be infringed upon? Will the counselor have a personal advantage over the client? Consider the client population whom you're dealing with, because this is really going to influence the kind of boundaries which you'll need to set or be sensitive to. Sometimes if you live like in a rural community, it might be difficult not to have a dual relationship. Turn to page 268 and look at the case of Millie. Millie is a therapist in a small community. One day she experienced heart pain. The fire department was called, and the medic on the team turned out to be her client, Andre. To administer proper medical care, Andre had to remove Millie's upper clothing. This was very difficult for Millie and probably Andre also, but it was an unavoidable dual relationship. Unfortunately, in their subsequent sessions, neither one of them ever talked about what happened or the situation. It became very uncomfortable, and after a while, Andre quit coming to counseling. Now, this could be, although the dual relationship, it was difficult to avoid that, the uncomfortableness could have been avoided if maybe they had just discussed what happened and maybe set some boundaries about the situation. She could have discussed why it was uncomfortable, and maybe they could have moved past that and continued their therapeutic relationship. In order to minimize some of the risks of a dual relationship, be sure and get informed consent and document very thoroughly. Set clear boundaries and expectations, both for yourself and the client. Talk about it with each other. How are you going to act when you meet your client in public? Can you say hello? Should you not? Pay attention to matters of confidentiality. Get involved with ongoing consultation.